Okay, so thank you so much, Louise, for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today delivering this plenary address and doing so in person in Manchester. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Manchester has been the site of a recent Guardian investigation into the links between the cotton industry and transatlantic slavery. While histories of how the newspaper came to be founded have previously focused on the events of Peterloo in 1819, situating it as part of a working class history of political protest and the liberal struggle for rights, the recent investigation draws links to other histories. It reveals that the funds from which the Guardian was able to be established by John Edward Taylor and his fellow investors came from the wealth that they made through their active involvement in the cotton industry, an industry that relied on raw material produced by enslaved peoples in the American South. As David Olusoga sets out as part of the Guardian's coverage, and here I'm quoting, much of the cotton that was spun, woven, dyed, processed, and traded in Manchester was produced by the almost 2 million enslaved Africans who lived, worked, and suffered on cotton plantations in the southern United States. Gary Young further argues that such histories have a wider importance beyond simply that of the foundation of the Guardian. And he questions why these histories are missing from our understandings of who we are and how we got here. He states that this refusal to engage with our full history matters not only because it impedes our capacity to understand what happened in the past, but because it also hinders our ability to understand what's going on today. These themes have been central to my own work, and I will return to some of these issues at the close of my talk. Before that, though, what I would like to do is to set out systematically how and why sociology as a discipline is complicit in such forgetting, and why a more adequate account of how we got here is necessary for developing a different politics in the present. In this talk, in this presidential address, I want to register the distance that has been traveled since the publication of my first book, Rethinking Modernity, Post-Colonialism and the Sociological Imagination, and set out some of the ongoing sociological challenges that I discuss at greater length in the preface to the second edition. While there is greater recognition across the discipline of the continuing legacies of colonialism and empire within contemporary societies, the significance of colonialism to the structure of the social sciences and to many of its core concerns, such as inequality, remains a relatively neglected topic. As I've argued on many occasions, our failure adequately to conceptualize the modern state as a colonial state and instead continue to consider it as a domestically bounded nation state is associated with the difficulties that we have in properly understanding inequality, both in terms of the historical processes that have constituted it and its contemporary manifestations locally and globally. So thinking through how we account for colonial histories in the present is a necessary aspect of any renewed sociological imagination. Within the standard literature, the emergence of the modern world is presented as a distinct and world historical stage in the development of human societies. It's also associated with the formation of the institutional structures of the nation state within Europe. Sociological concepts are then oriented to what is distinctive about the modern world and how that modern world is differentiated from what preceded it. Questions of legitimacy are central to these processes, and it is these questions that I take issue with in this talk. This is both in terms of the political legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of our knowledge claims, that is, of the social sciences and specifically of sociology. The modern era is defined, at least in part, by the transformation of the legitimating basis of political authority and of the modes of knowledge production. So the source of political authority shifts from the divine and purely hereditary claims of authority and right to being seen as resting in the people. The idea of legitimate knowledge itself develops from a theological basis, grounded in speculative philosophy and metaphysics, to an understanding of knowledge produced through an engagement with the world and oriented to practical application within it. The two developments are, of course, related. During the modern period, we see the theories of social contract and sovereignty become central to our understandings of political legitimacy and the establishment of states. In particular, the identification of the person of the monarch or sovereign with the state gives way to the state beginning to be understood through those who have been subject to rule. That is, the people understood as constituting a nation. When the state was organized in terms of its ruling dynasty, then, as David Beetham argues, its boundaries were whatever happened to have been historically determined by conquest, marriage, or dynastic alliance. However, as this shifts, then issues of national identity and national autonomy come to assume a wholly new political significance. As political legitimacy comes to be understood as coming from the people, it becomes important to understand who the people are and how the state can support their development. That is, what are their obligations and their rights. The development of the idea of popular sovereignty made the national community, or society as it came to be more generally known, the focus of the state. With the attention of the state turned on to the society to which it was responsible, social theory, and then later sociology, turned its attention to the state in the name of that society. In this way, sociology comes to be a central part of the modernizing project of both the state and society alike, and establishes itself as integral to the understandings of political legitimacy that organize the state. We can see this relationship between the state, society, and sociology oriented to questions of legitimacy, perhaps most clearly in the works of Max Weber. As Weber set out in his inaugural lecture in Freiburg in 1895, the purpose of social scientific knowledge was to further the political development of the national state and to secure the position of national citizens within it. The point of becoming a nation, according to Weber, was to become a world power, that is, a colonial power. The economic strength of the nation was to be established through colonial political ambitions, specifically expansion. The national interest, then, was not the construction of a national state, but a colonial state. This focus on expansion and concomitant domination, however, was never explicitly theorized in the development of his understanding of the sociology of the state or the sociology of political legitimacy. This was not developed by Weber, nor has it been developed by those who followed him, as I will discuss shortly. Just as the modern state comes to be the container for determining the configuration of the social sciences, so the social sciences become central in setting out the legitimacy of the modern state in national terms. Indeed, the social sciences are predicated on the unassailable notion of the legitimacy of the modern social order, a social order that is defined as modern without any consideration of the colonial histories that have enabled it. Considering colonial histories opens up these issues, and it requires us to rethink fundamental assumptions that have long been regarded as established and beyond contestation. One such fundamental assumption is the idea that modern politics is centrally and properly organized around the nation state. As Jürgen Habermas, among others, has argued, this idea itself has its origins in the system of sovereign states that came into being in Europe with the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. The history of the modern nation-state is understood to be further shaped by the US and then French revolutions in the late 18th century. And the standard account goes something like this. Within Europe, there are seen to be two routes to modern statehood. The first was the evolution of nation-states within the boundaries of existing territorial states, as was the case for most North and Western European states. The second was in establishing a nation and then a state, as exemplified by the projects of Germany and Italy in the late 19th century. And then you have the subsequent formation of states in Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th. These initial formations are followed in the period of mass decolonization in the mid to late 20th century by the establishment of what are called post-colonial states. And then a final moment in the history of nation-states is presented as the secession of states from the Soviet Union in the aftermath of its collapse in the late 20th century. This brief historical outline of the emergence of modern states, derived from Habermas, is commonplace within the social science literature. And it is this that I take issue with, particularly this idea that it's possible to posit a post-colonial state without addressing the processes of colonization themselves as part of state formation. As David Beetham notes in Legitimation of Power, in the middle of the 20th century, the ideals of self-determination and national independence were turned against the European powers by the people of the Third World. This undermined whatever legitimacy their imperial rule may have had. Despite extensive reading, I have not been able to discover the substance of the claim, whatever legitimacy their imperial rule may have had. The period that is seen to give rise to the modern state is precisely a period of colonial expansion that saw some European states consolidate their domination over other parts of the world. And yet that external domination, that is, domination beyond national boundaries, is rarely theorized as a constitutive aspect of the modern state itself, which instead of being understood as a colonial state, is understood in national terms. The period from at least 1648 onwards is a period of the dominance of Spain and Portugal, primarily in the southern half of the Americas, of Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, among other European countries, of conquest and domination in the Americas, and across Africa and Asia. As mentioned earlier, Weber's national state is explicitly an expansionist state, organized in terms of colonial domination, and we can see this process at work across European states. The expansion of the United States from coast to coast should also be regarded in terms of colonial domination and not the establishment of a national state. The forms of domination may have varied from actual conquest, followed by settlement, to the establishment of colonial and dependency status elsewhere. The issue here is not so much with the particular mode of incorporation, but with the wholesale erasure of that external domination from the theorization of the modern state as it is seen to develop within Europe and then to understandings of its legitimacy. Picking up on the earlier discussion of Weber, we see that his definition of the modern state as that entity which successfully secures the legitimate exercise of coercive power within a given territory is commonplace within the discipline. Such an understanding associates a particular population with a given territory and makes the state responsible to and responsible for that population. This, however, fails to take into account the actions of the state upon populations beyond these boundaries, and towards whom there is no relationship of emerging equality of status, only of domination. One aspect of the political legitimacy of the modern state is the association of the people with the state, and the idea that over time, at least, the people will become equal citizens within that state. While formal equality of status was hierarchically ordered in terms of class and gender, the standard sociological account is that an underlying equality will lead to the dissolving of these hierarchies. The situation is somewhat more complicated for those subjects of rule whose relationship to the national state continued to be organized in terms of domination and not equality. For example, the situation of Polish people, Jewish people, and Roma in the emerging German state. Or we could point the example towards those who could technically obtain citizenship of another country today in Britain. My focus here, however, is the way in which the idea of legitimacy is associated with responsibility to and for the population within the national boundaries of the state, while the exercise of power over those beyond the national state is not regarded as being of significance. Others are unproblematically incorporated into the ambit of the modern nation state through colonial conquest, but this does not alter the claim to nationhood as the basis of political legitimacy that is otherwise being made. The colonies are simply subjugated and allied territories of no empirical or ideological significance. Ditto colonial populations. The asymmetry at issue here is perhaps most clearly highlighted when we consider taxation. Taxation is seen to be central to the social contract that binds together rulers and ruled within the modern state. As the authors of A Call for a New Fiscal Sociology have set out, and I quote, "Taxes formalize our obligations to each other. They define the inequalities we accept and those that we collectively seek to redress." Martin, Mehrotra, and Prasad go on to argue that as taxation enmeshes us in a web of generalized reciprocity, it is crucial to the development of the imagined community of the nation. In this way, then, a focus on taxation and its distributed returns to citizens via welfare is seen to clarify the nature of the state, its limits, and its boundaries. That is, it is seen to define the national character of the state. However, taxation was not simply organized within national boundaries, but it was applied also to the colonies and colonial subjects. Once Britain took over direct rule of India in 1857, for example, one of its first acts was to require the payment of income tax in addition to long-standing taxes on land and goods that had been collected by the East India Company. At this time, the working and middle classes of Britain did not have to pay any income tax, and indeed didn't go on to pay income tax until the period of the First World War. They were, however, recipients of various forms of state welfare, such as poor relief, national assistance, and other public goods. Paradoxically, despite paying income and other taxes, Indian colonial subjects were not entitled to any redistribution of that taxation, not even in the event of catastrophic famines produced by British colonial policies in India. Here we see that while taxation was collected across the colonial realm, with the receipts being amassed in Westminster, redistribution only occurred within national boundaries. This is why I argue that Britain should be understood as a colonial state that has a national project at its heart. And this is why every time sociologists and others take the nation state as the unit of analysis and not the wider empire or colonial state, the political and economic asymmetries of colonial rule are elided, and in that elision are reproduced. The injustice embodied in that asymmetry is central to contemporary arguments about whose claims have legitimacy within public discourse and who is entitled to the benefits of the state. Thinking about how and why such a situation pertains, one answer may be found in the work of legal theorist Anthony Anghie. He argues that it is the doctrine of sovereignty itself that sets up the non-European world as excluded from its understandings and at the same time legitimizes colonial domination. He goes on to suggest, though, that it's unclear how it was decided that non-European states or populations were not sovereign in the first place. As I will go on to argue, it is precisely in response to this issue, how it was decided that non-European states were not sovereign and that colonized populations were not to be considered as subjects of the state, that we see the broader implication of sociology, and in particular the use of stadial theory as the justification of this proposition. So as I've argued, sociology emerged in the 19th century as the consolidation of a particular mode of thought, one that would provide the theoretical basis from which European societies viewed their relationships to those they considered other. Sociology's explanation of modernity was located in the context of an identification of a distinct social domain and a historical understanding of forms whereby each form of social organization was to be superseded by a progressively higher one. The Stadial, or stages theory of history, developed primarily from the work of the Scottish Enlightenment, was one solution to the problem of accommodating difference within a universal framework. The essential idea of stadial theory that was picked up and developed subsequently by sociologists was, as Meek argues, that societies undergo development through successive stages based on different modes of subsistence. These stages were generally understood as being from hunting and gathering to pastoral to settled agriculture and finally to commerce. Perhaps most importantly, stadial theory was not simply a descriptive account of socioeconomic development, but it was a normative account, in that it provided, as Meek states, the basis of an evaluation both of the savage state and that of polished modern commercial society. In this way, then, stadial theory established a conceptual framework for the hierarchical ranking of contemporaneous societies organized in terms of a unidirectional notion of linear progress. This generalized historical narrative becomes a background assumption of the emergent social sciences, where it's reproduced in subsequent theoretical and substantive initiatives. Once the general pattern of historical development was claimed to be known, it was then believed that the trajectory of development for other societies could be worked out without any direct research. The differences between societies were simply variations of a general pattern, and the idea of historical progress is what enabled them to be understood within a common conceptual frame. All differences were associated with processes deemed to be internal to the societies being considered, and there was no accounting for the impact of societies upon each other in terms of how they should be understood. Modernity was the present that showed other societies their future, and insofar as modernity itself was under criticism, it was only in relation to its own unfinished nature. The idea of historical progress, then, comes to structure sociology as a discipline and its modes of critique at precisely the time that it removes consideration of historical processes from it. As I highlighted at the start of this talk, it is the idea of historical connections and their relevance in the present that the Guardian investigation has sought to uncover. To think about the ways in which what is presented as national history has a wider provenance in histories of colonialism and the consequences of this, both for social science research and for the possibilities of politics in the present. The investigation has been both celebrated and criticized, with one particular line of argument against it, suggesting that it was capitalism and not slavery that made Britain rich, and as such, we should stop apologizing for our past. Specifically, the argument is that because Britain was the first country to industrialize, it could afford to abolish slavery as slavery had become obsolete. In the same article, the author has a throwaway line that taxes were higher in Britain than in the colonies. All of this is incorrect. Working backwards, the questions to ask would be the following. What was the legitimacy of taxing people in the colonies? What was the legitimacy of colonization? Even if we were to accept that slavery was made obsolete by industrialization, then A, how do we account for the relationship of slavery to industrialization? And B, how do we account for the practices of indenture that replaced slavery? Over 2 million indentured workers were forcibly transported from India and China to work on British plantations in the Caribbean and across the Indian Ocean world after the abolition of slavery. And this practice of indenture was not abolished till the early 20th century. Finally, we come to the relationship between industrialization and capitalism. Those of you who may have heard me speak on such topics previously will know that I often ask people the following question. Where did the Industrial Revolution begin? A little voice said Manchester. I heard it. It's always Manchester. Wherever I do the talk, wherever I ask the question, the answer is almost always Manchester, and in part because of the cotton mills of Manchester. And indeed, most histories of the Industrial Revolution, including those presented within sociological texts and that sociologists rely on, suggest that the revolution began with the cotton mills in Manchester. The one thing that they all fail to account for, as Utsa Patnaik argues, is the remarkable story of how a country that did not produce the raw material, raw cotton, based its industrial revolution on cotton textiles. Cotton is a plant that's native to India, not to Britain, not to Europe. The cultivation of cotton and the manufacture of cotton textiles goes back 5,000 years to the Indus Valley civilization. And India has been an exporter of cotton textiles across much of human history. In the 1600s, the English East India Company began importing significant quantities of cotton textiles from India. The popularity of the textile was such that it led the woolen cloth merchants in 1700 to petition the government for a complete legal ban on its sale and consumption. This continued through until the late 18th century, when the mechanization of the process of cotton manufacture was deemed to be of sufficient commercial value to be developed locally. This then led to a repeal on the ban on consumption, but high tariffs of up to 85% on printed and painted calicos from India was enforced. This 150-year period of protectionism, organized through mercantilist policies targeting Indian textile imports, was the context in which the cotton industry in Manchester was able to get going and then to flourish. However, it's a history that's not even mentioned by any major historian in Britain of the Industrial Revolution and technical change. It's not mentioned by Dean and Cole, or Landers, or Hobsbawm, or Floud, or McCloskey, or Hill, nor then by sociologists who are interested in the emergence of the modern world and who might also be interested in issues of political economy. The Industrial Revolution is seen to have begun in Britain as a consequence of the marvelousness of the British themselves. From having had a 25% share of the global market for textiles in the early 18th century, British colonial policies had reduced India to becoming a supplier of raw cotton for the British industry by the end of the 19th. Indian manufacture was systematically destroyed, as were Indian livelihoods and their lives that depended on that manufacture. As the Governor-General in India, William Bentinck, noted in 1818, and I quote, "The misery hardly finds parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." Alongside the systematic destruction of Indian manufacture to aid its own incipient cotton industry, the British also made use of cheap raw cotton produced by enslaved and coerced labor on plantations. These plantations, it might surprise you to learn, were not only in the southern states of the US, as highlighted by the Guardian investigation, but also existed across India. In the 1840s, the Manchester Chamber of Commerce and the newly set up Cotton Supply Association lobbied the colonial government in India to privilege the cultivation of the New Orleans variety of cotton over indigenous cotton, and this was in order to serve British manufacture. The subsequent displacement of local peasant subsistence farming, as well as mass deforestation to serve this new venture, contributed, as Sandeep Zirasinghe argues, to worsening climatic conditions in the regions, and thus to the increase of famine across the continent. During the 19th century, India supplied about a third of the raw cotton used in Britain, and during the period of the US Civil War, this went up to about 2/3. The conditions on colonial plantations in India were no less severe than those elsewhere, although there were, of course, differences. Examining the links between the cotton industry in Manchester and transatlantic slavery is of vital importance. The full history, as Gary Young sets out, requires us also to take into account the fact that the colonialism that contributed to the wealth and industry of Britain was global, not just transatlantic. It further requires us to acknowledge that the structures of capitalism that are otherwise lauded themselves emerge from colonial practices that need to be accounted for. Cotton capital is more adequately understood as cotton colonialism. It's not possible to understand the cotton industry in Manchester without locating it in the processes that first reaped immense profits from the imports of cotton from India. As Macaulay says, treasure flowed to England in oceans. And it's not possible to understand it without thinking about the devastation of Indian cotton textiles and their manufacture. It's not possible to understand the class politics consequent to the emergence of industrialization in Manchester without locating it both in the destruction of work and the workforce in colonial India and the modes of enslaved and coerced labor on plantations globally that were concurrent with it. It's not possible to understand entitlements to welfare and other public goods today, except by accounting for the asymmetrical requirement for colonial subjects to pay taxes that were only ever redistributed nationally. Finally, there is no capitalism without colonialism. As such, it's not possible to evade responsibility for histories of colonialism and slavery by focusing on capitalism. That, too, is only possible through colonialism. However, before you start thinking I'm a historian of cotton, let me return to sociology in the present and the challenge that the history of colonialism poses to it. Through this talk, I hope I've set out sufficient arguments to make plausible the claim that colonialism is the context in which the division between what are understood as modern and traditional societies comes to be established. Further, that the entities that we standardly consider as nations across time were rarely that, but instead were implicated in broader colonial initiatives and need to be understood in those terms. If we were to recognize the role of colonialism in the very structuring of modern societies, then we would need to reconfigure what we understand sociology to be. Colonialism cannot simply be added as a topic to the discipline, but it has to be the basis of a thoroughgoing reconstruction. A reconstruction that pays attention to how colonialism has structured our world, our knowledge claims, and our very ability to know. It is a reconstruction that opens up the possibility of a reparatory sociology. And I conclude my talk by identifying 3 crucial moments in its development. First, the histories of Europe that predominate within the social sciences must be understood within their broader colonial context. The grand narrative of modernity that underpins social science needs to be understood in terms of a narrative of colonial modernity. This is an inclusive move that seeks to account for the shape of Europe and the world as a consequence of global practices of domination and appropriation. It is these histories that have produced the modern world, and they need to form the basis from which we rethink sociology. Second, while the nation-state is a primary unit of analysis across the social sciences, I would suggest that it's more appropriate for that to be empire or the colonial state. The period that is seen to give rise to the modern nation-state is precisely a period of colonial expansion that saw some European states consolidate their domination over other parts of the world within colonial formations. Yet what is seen as external domination is rarely theorized as a constitutive aspect of the modern state. The modern state, I suggest, cannot be adequately understood outside of thinking through how these relationships have shaped it. Third, epistemological justice is central to any reparatory sociology. This involves recognition of the knowledge claims of others in terms both of respect and reconstructive response, whether it's in terms of disagreement or agreement. A central aspect of this would be an ethical practice of scholarship that acknowledges the work that has already gone on by those whose activism has forced our attention, as well as engaging productively with critiques and contestations around their implications for contemporary politics. And here I include the politics of knowledge production. Further, epistemological justice cannot be understood outside of a commitment to justice more broadly. And here I'm specifically arguing for material reparations as the practical embodiment of a reparatory sociology. The injustices of the past cannot be repaired, in the sense that suffering could be undone or the past restored. Nor is an argument for reparations an argument for compensation of individual loss. It's an argument about current inequities in distribution being placed beyond the purview of justice by virtue of being represented as merely historical. In this view, reparations would go beyond liberal ideas of individual compensation and be organized instead in social democratic terms. That is, while colonialism and colonial histories are responsible for the significant global inequalities that structure our world, any solution must be inclusive and available to all. A reparatory sociology requires both the repair of the social sciences as well as being invested in the collective address of the inequalities implicitly legitimated by standard social science. Recognizing the modern world as the colonial world enables us more adequately to contextualize events and processes that are often presented as separate and to understand them within a connected frame of reference, one that's committed to repair and transformation, and a world that works for us all.